And again, we're just waiting for folks to file in from the waiting room before we get started in just a moment. Thank you for your patience. Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I know there are still some people coming in from the waiting room, but thank you all for being here so much this afternoon. My name is Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at UC Irvine. And I'd like to welcome you to this, the 6th in our Zot Zeries seminar series, where we're spotlighting the role of the social and behavioral sciences in understanding the coronavirus pandemic and its economic, social, and political consequences. So far, we've had talks from faculty in anthropology, political sciences, including policy, and cognitive sciences. And today, we're joined by 2 of our faculty from the Department of Logic and the Philosophy of Science. I'll introduce them in a moment. But first, for those who are unfamiliar with this format, we're using Zoom's webinar feature, which allows you to post a question, if you have one, for our presenters in the Q&A box near the bottom of your screen. So what will happen is our presenters will give a presentation, and then you can post a question at any time in that Q&A box. I will then be reading the questions to our presenters, time permitting, and hopefully we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. This is being recorded, and the session will be posted on the School of Social Sciences website sometime later on this afternoon. So if you'd like to share it with a friend or go back and look at it again later, it'll be available on the School of Social Sciences website at socsci.uci.edu. So it looks like some people are still coming in, but I'd like to welcome and thank our presenters for today, Professors Jim Weatherall and Cailin O'Connor. They are professors in the Department of Logic and the Philosophy of Science at UC Irvine and co-authors of the recent book, The Misinformation Age, How False Beliefs Spread, which is something that many in the world were already quite concerned about before the pandemic and which has now taken on a special urgency. Jim is also a philosopher, physicist, and mathematician, and the author of 2 other books, Void, The Strange Politics of Nothing, and The Physics of Wall Street. And Cailin is a philosopher of biology, the behavioral sciences, and evolutionary game theory, and is the author also of 2 books, The Origins of Unfairness, Social Categories and Cultural Evolution, and Games in the Philosophy of Biology. They're also both at work on research related to a National Science Foundation grant on the public understanding of science. And with that, I will hand it off to Professors Weatherall and O'Connor.
Thanks very much, Bill.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I also just want to point out to anyone who hasn't noticed already, Jim and I are married, and we're doing the weirdest Zoom thing possible, which is we're sitting next to each other, but with 2 different screens. So you can see them over there. So that might explain some things you see. All right. Take it away, Jim.
Great, thanks, Cailin. Great, thanks, Bill. So let's just dive right in. So as Bill mentioned, we have been working on a number of different issues related to science and misinformation and disinformation and industrial and political propaganda, the persistence and spread of false belief for about 5 years now. A lot of this work appeared in a book that came out a little over a year ago called The Misinformation Age, in which we look at historical cases and try to use mathematical models, computer simulations, to understand how and why false beliefs manage to persist and spread, even in situations where there's a lot of evidence available. That might be used to determine that they're false. And so we look at a number of different things, including both what we think of as endogenous and exogenous drivers of false belief and polarization. So what I mean by endogenous here are things that are sort of happen within a community without anyone having to intervene. And so we look at how things like trust or a tendency to trust some people more than others can lead to the persistence and spread of false belief. We look at how conformity can do that and other things. But then we also look, as I said, at exogenous factors like industrial propaganda, media practices, in some cases, political interference in, say, scientific communities. Now, like many people who have written about these sorts of issues recently, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, we talk about lots of things that might get classified as either misinformation or disinformation. And so misinformation, we think of as content that, when it's produced, is wrong and is sort of knowably wrong. It's readily refuted at the time of production. Examples might be unfounded rumors, just pure speculation, and in many cases, though not all, conspiracy theories. Also, we count things like errors, so something where someone just made a mistake, but it sort of propagates through the social transmission of information on, say, on Twitter afterwards. And one can contrast these sorts of things with disinformation, which is content that's intentionally designed to mislead or manipulate. So maybe someone wishes to control public belief on something. Perhaps you are the tobacco industry, and you would like it to be the case that people believe that smoking tobacco is not harmful. And so you might try to introduce an information campaign, a disinformation campaign, to influence what people think about tobacco. In other cases, the point of disinformation is just to make people angry at each other and increase what's called affective polarization, which is the tendency of people to have very different kinds of reactions to some piece of information. Now, all of these sorts of things are widespread in connection with COVID-19. So here's an example. Early on in the pandemic in the United States, there were viral chain emails and posts on Facebook and Twitter attributed to Stanford Medical School, although they apparently had nothing to do with Stanford, describing ways in which you could protect yourself or check whether or not you, in fact, have the coronavirus. And so, for example, if you hold your breath for 10 seconds, it claimed you cannot have SARS-CoV-2. This is not true, I'm afraid. But it was something that spread widely, an example of just an unfounded rumor, sort of baseless at the time, readily debunked. Some examples of misinformation along these lines are more troubling and more dangerous. And so, for instance, there's been a viral spread of misinformation in Iran that drinking pure alcohol can cure the COVID-19. And this has led to hundreds of people dying from drinking pure, and in some cases, methyl alcohol. Similarly, in the US, we've had examples of people drinking or injecting disinfectant of various sorts to try to cure themselves or prevent the coronavirus, because they believe that this is going to be efficacious. Moving on to sort of another class, there are many, many conspiracy theories related to SARS-CoV-2. So just one prominent one, of course, is that there's not a virus causing disease, but that actually it's 5G towers, you know, the new cellular technology that's causing the COVID-19. And so this has led people to do things like try to attack towers, in one case, a sort of tragic case, an engineer working on a 5G tower was spit on by someone who was following this conspiracy theory and ended up getting sick, getting COVID-19 apparently as a result. Okay, so we're seeing this kind of thing, you know, the sorts of things that we classed as misinformation. There are also some examples of disinformation connected to COVID-19. And so here's an example of a state-sponsored disinformation campaign. In Iran, the government has supported groups that are arguing that COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes it, was a bioweapon produced in the United States and intentionally spread elsewhere, including in Iran, by the Trump administration. So this cartoon is fairly high production value example of that group's output. And then I'm not going to talk about what's going on with this at all, but it's another example of something that is certainly at least misinformation, possibly disinformation, that has been all over the place on social media in just the last week. There's a documentary called Plandemic. Okay, so lots of examples of the usual suspects, things people have talked about before. We're not going to talk about those. What we want to do is highlight some of the ways in which other, less discussed, but we think very important types and sources of misinformation have come to play a role in public discourse about SARS-CoV-2. Now, we want to emphasize we aren't trying to claim that these are new, that these are somehow unique to this situation. They're always there. But we think that we're faced with a unique scientific, cultural, and political context in which these particular kinds of misinformation have become much more salient than they were, for instance, in connection with the 2016-2018 elections in the US, the Brexit vote in 2016, other places, contexts where people have worried a lot about misinformation and disinformation. So we think it's important to highlight these new things. Okay, so we're going to talk about two things in particular. One that we're going to call information zombies, another that we're going to call belief factions. I'm not going to tell you what these words mean now because I want to create a sense of suspense, but we will get to it. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a story. January 31st of this year, a group of researchers working in India posted a new paper on a preprint server called bioRxiv, where medical researchers and biologists post their research before it's been published in a scientific journal. Now, what these researchers had done was examined the genome, the RNA sequence that is the coronavirus, and found something that they thought was shocking. They found what they called an uncanny similarity between part of this genetic sequence and RNA that codes for certain proteins in HIV. They concluded from this that SARS-CoV-2 was a man-made, or at least partially manufactured virus that resulted from taking some coronavirus and introducing particular segments from HIV to make it more infectious. Now, almost immediately, this was savagely criticized by hundreds of medical researchers all over the world. You can see there are 126 comments on this preprint. Most of them are specific criticisms of various things in the article. Within days, this article was retracted. And in fact, if you squint, you can see in very small letters up here at the top left corner, it actually says withdrawn. And so the authors have actually, have withdrawn this article. Within a few days of it being withdrawn, it was refuted by peer-reviewed research, very clearly showing that the findings of this earlier paper were wrong. Nonetheless, in the following months, this article has gone completely viral. And in fact, according to Altmetric, which is an organization that studies and records the engagement of scientific articles in the public press and on social media, this is one of the most highly engaged with and discussed articles in the history of science, or in the history of the 10 years that Altmetric has been doing this, let's put it that way. It's been tweeted 18,580 times since February 1st, even though already on February 2nd, it had been withdrawn by the authors. Okay, so now I'm going to turn over to Cailin to talk a little bit about what this means.
Well, thank you, Jim. So Jim and I have been using the term information zombies to try to capture what's going on in cases like this. So these are ideas that ought to be dead, but they keep shambling about the internet, causing problems. Now, importantly, as Jim alluded to, in many cases, these don't resemble typical misinformation because they're not unfounded rumors, they're not active disinformation, they're not conspiracy theories. Instead, a lot of these information zombies are ideas that have some scientific legitimacy, that are coming from legitimate sources, and are reflecting an attempt at truth-telling. And what this means is that they're not going to look like other kinds of misinformation, and therefore will sometimes be harder to deal with, harder to identify, harder to fact-check, harder to counter in argument. And what's happening is that they have this legitimacy that then after they are retracted, reversed, or refuted, they refuse to die, and that's what's causing problems. Now, we want to note that this kind of phenomena is not limited to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's not even limited to the spread of information and ideas on social media. So there's now quite a body of work in the social sciences and the medical sciences looking at what happens after scientific articles are retracted and finding that they are often cited approvingly long after retraction. So often for years after retraction, they're cited at very high rates. So just to give one little example, in 2010, this very prominent anesthesiologist, Scott Rubin, was found to have been committing fraud. So he had been manufacturing data rather than running actual trials. 21 articles of his were retracted as a result of this fraud. 4 years later, researchers investigated these papers and found that over half of them were being consistently cited, and not cited as something that had been retracted, but rather cited as accurate data. So we can ask, what's going on in this case? Why do information zombies keep walking? And why are scientists, people whose job it is to figure out what is true or false, susceptible to the same kind of problem that we're seeing on social media sites during the COVID-19 pandemic? So in attempting to answer this question, myself, along with 2 UCI students, so on the left there you have Anders Geil, who's recently gone to start a PhD in computer science, and on the right, Travis Lacroix, who is a student in our department until the end of this year. We worked together to try to look at these failures of retraction and understand why they happen. And the answer, at least in part, has to do with the way that people share information. So as humans, we're all social learners, which means that we pass what we learn on to friends and peers. And what that means is that new ideas tend to spread and propagate in our social networks, moving from person to person to person. And we looked in this paper at models where we tried to investigate the dynamics of information spread and then the dynamics of how retracted information might spread. So dynamics about how information that something had been retracted might also spread on social networks. So I'm not going to talk too much here about the details of our model, or even that much about the details of results, but what I want to do is give some kind of sense of how they work and then talk about some of the most important takeaways and what they tell us. So we can, we can imagine a social network. So this is supposed to be a representation of people and their information sharing links. So that could be a friendship, but it could also be a follower relationship on Twitter, or that you always read some journalist. And here we have someone who is highlighted in yellow. So let's say this person has developed a new idea. Maybe that SARS-CoV-2 was engineered using the HIV virus. And through their social connection, this idea can start to spread. Of course, with things like preprint servers and social media and publishing, the actual process in the real world is much quicker than I'm showing it in this little animation. But the idea is the same, that these social links allow these ideas to propagate. Now, an important observation is that there's actually a difference between how many novel claims and their retractions spread on these networks, because retractions only tend to spread where false beliefs have already gone. Why might that be the case? So If we think about why we share things with each other, it's usually because these are pieces of information or ideas that are relevant or interesting or novel or somehow are going to mean something to the person we tell them to. We don't share things that are totally irrelevant to people's lives. But when it comes to a retraction, the fact that something was false, that tends to be most relevant to people who had already heard of the false belief or had already known that it was spreading, that other people believed it or who believed it themselves. So retractions alone tend to be generally kind of context sensitive. They'll only spread in places where there already is false belief. So if we turn back to this little model, we could imagine that the original researcher admits, like, it turns out this wasn't good research, I'm going to withdraw it. Now the fact that it's been withdrawn could start to spread in their social network, just like the original false belief did. But it's not going to be likely to spread to parts of the social network where there aren't already false ideas, and then it can't take paths to other parts of the social network. So it's in some ways going to be inhibited. So we did a lot of things with these models, looked at many different kinds of cases, different situations in which false beliefs and their retractions might spread. Let me just give a couple important takeaways here. So one, originators lose control of their ideas and they cannot just reverse them. So because of this process by which information shares socially, the person who starts an idea loses control of it. The information takes on a life of its own. So when they want to say, oops, I was wrong, let's claw that back, it's too late. The cat's out of the bag. Retractions often don't spread in the same way an original false claim might be, and they can be inhibited by this fact that they're context dependent. In many cases, people who hear a false claim often simply fail to hear a retraction. So if we think of this process of the spread of a false claim, either by an accident of history or because a retraction isn't spreading as quickly, there are going to be a lot of people who hear the falsehood and just never actually get the other better piece of information. False claims continue to spread even after they're known to be false, even ones that are scientific claims. And related to that, information zombies look, walk, and quack like reliable information. So if we think about people sharing a scientific claim, a scientist might realize it's false, but that doesn't change necessarily anything about what they're sharing, right? So it might not change the process of the spread of this original false claim hardly at all. Okay, so with that, now I'm going to hand it back to Jim, who's going to turn to a more recent case, a kind of emerging case of what looks like an information zombie to give this a little more life.
And what I think is really interesting about this case is not just that it's something that's sort of live right now, but also that it's very subtle. It doesn't involve a retraction. It involves a revision, but a revision that ends up making things that have sort of emanated from this false in an interesting way. So this study was widely reported. It first appeared online on April 17th of this year. It was an example of what's known as a seroprevalence study. And so basically what the researchers were doing was looking at blood samples from about 3,000 people in Santa Clara County and asking whether or not those people had antibodies, proteins that reflect an immune reaction to SARS-CoV-2. And the idea is that if you detect antibodies, that means these people have previously been exposed to and presumably recovered from the novel coronavirus, even if they were never confirmed cases or perhaps didn't even know that they were sick. Now, the study, when it came out, was very widely reported. Articles on it appeared everywhere. It was widely discussed on social media and elsewhere. A number of other scientists quickly pointed out some concerns about the study. So one class of concern had to do with how the study participants were recruited. Mostly they were recruited by Facebook ad, which some people thought meant that it was more likely that people who had previously had symptoms would show up to volunteer for the study, therefore skewing the results. Another concern that has emerged more recently is that it seems that one of the author's spouses forwarded this Facebook message to a group of friends from school, suggesting that this would be a way for them to find out that whether or not they'd had it already. And so this raised another set of concerns about the independence of the sample, and again, about just how representative it was. I'm not going to talk about those concerns further. I want to talk about a very specific concern that was also voiced, having to do with how uncertainty was calculated within the study. And so it was observed very quickly that the tests that they used in this paper had a certain false positive rate. But there was some uncertainty about what that false positive rate was. So what's the probability that someone would get a positive result if they didn't actually have the antibody? Now, it turned out that given the data that was reported in the paper, it was compatible with their false positive rate, that every single one of their positive results was a false one. But the results that they reported, which were interesting and significant and widely discussed because they suggested such a high number of people had already been exposed, a shockingly high number of people had already been exposed in Santa Clara County to the disease, didn't show uncertainty that went all the way down to 0, which it would have to, if the errors related to the false positive rate had been properly propagated. Now, in some sense, this was a mistake, but to the author's credit, they quickly addressed it. And 10 days after that first preprint appeared, they wrote another paper, or they revised the paper and posted it online, fixing two things. One, they got a much better estimate of what the false positive rate was, thereby reducing their uncertainty about that. But then in addition, they recalculated their errors and got a more accurate estimate of the uncertainty concerning their result. But this meant that their result was actually much more uncertain in the end and reflected a much wider range of possible consistent facts on the ground than the original paper suggested. Now, I should say they didn't address any of the issues about the recruiting study participants, and so plenty of people are still critical of this paper, but I'm setting all of those things aside. Okay, so let's just summarize quickly what the difference was. In the first paper, they estimated that the true number of cases in Santa Clara County was 50 to 85 times as high in early April as the number of confirmed cases. This implied that the fatality rate, the number of people who died, or the fraction of people who died among the infected, was somewhere between 0.12 and 0.2%, which was startlingly low, much lower than many people were estimating at the time. In the revised paper, with the wider error bars that more accurately reflected the uncertainty of the experiment, they estimated that between 25 times and 91 times as many true cases, as confirmed cases. This led to an implied infection fatality rate that went from 0.11 to 0.4%. Notice that the upper edge of this, the upper end of the uncertainty, is now twice as high as it was previously. And this really matters because all of a sudden, this study went from one that seemed to show startlingly low fatality rates, right? Because it was bounded from above, it seemed like, with 95% confidence intervals, bounded from above by 0.2% IFR, which is much lower than what many people had estimated previously, to something that was on the low side, but was entirely compatible with many other estimates, including estimates going back all the way to February from the WHO, which at the time estimated that between the infection fatality rate was somewhere between 0.3% and 1%. Widespread current estimates now put it between 0.3 and 0.7. And so this study is very much compatible with that now. Despite these changes, and despite the fact that the sort of upshot of the article and its significance has shifted because of these somewhat minor, you might think, revisions to the analysis, this has not been widely reported. And in particular, the day that the first draft of the paper appeared on a preprint archive, one of the authors published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal with the title, "New Data Suggests the Coronavirus Isn't as Deadly as We Thought," which there are issues with this op-ed I'm not going to get into, but it does accurately reflect an implied infection fatality rate as reported in the original paper, but doesn't really reflect the implied infection fatality rate in the revised paper. Despite this, and as I said, this was reported all over the place. It's not just the Wall Street Journal, but this was one of their authors, and so you might think the author would be particularly tuned in to the issue. Nothing about this op-ed has changed. The version that I have here is from today. Same title, still reports the 50 to 85 times figure from the original paper, and nothing about the text has changed. Indeed, here is something from my Facebook wall, newsfeed, from today, sponsored content from the Wall Street Journal with this article. New data suggests the coronavirus isn't as deadly as we thought. If you click on it, you find the old figure still being reported. This is, as I say, from today. And so the article itself isn't an information zombie, but this particular claim, which has subsequently been retracted and revised by the scientists, continues to not just propagate, but be sort of pushed out by news sites, even though it's no longer true. All right, I'm going to turn things back to Cailin to sort of summarize.
So we might ask here, what are the practical consequences of this sort of misinformation that's coming from legitimate sources that doesn't look like normal misinformation? So here are a few of them. So first, the sharing of unvetted or under-tested scientific claims can have serious harms. So we might think something like, look, we're trying to find out about COVID really quickly. It's important to get this science out, to share it really quickly. But in fact, what we see is that once we share these things that are, under-tested and are likely to turn out to be false, they take on a life of their own and they influence people's decision-making and what they believe about COVID. So this really can be harmful. Now, related to this, journalists reporting on COVID-19 and the science of it should be reporting on multiple studies and surveying all known data wherever they can. Because part of what's going on is that there are these kind of new studies put out on preprints, maybe done really quickly, and journalists report on just these one studies, but they're quite likely to have problems or to be wrong. Whereas reporting that takes into account everything we know to date is much less likely to have this problem where it will need to be reversed. And then a last kind of consequence is that we should all shout retractions to the rooftops. It can be awkward and embarrassing to say that you're wrong, but given how important it is to reverse... Yeah. Well, okay, you can plug it in and call Ava again if you want.
No, we can't. Sorry.
Not right now, guys. Just get the plug and plug it in, okay?
We don't know where it is.
It's in the drawer where we would normally keep your iPads. I can't talk. I'm giving a talk right now, Vera.
Okay.
Then you're giving a talk, so you can talk.
Moving on. We're going to move on. Moving on, we're going to address the other topic, belief factions. This is academia in the age of coronavirus right here. So belief factions, the other topic. And again, I'm going to start with a story. You'll get the sense I'm going to give the stories.
Quick story.
A quick story. And Cailin's going to give the analysis. So when the novel coronavirus was first identified in China, a fairly large group, there were 2 independent organizations working on this, of researchers in China started testing known drugs in vitro. So they took infected cells, put them in a test tube, and tried to see whether or not known pharmaceuticals or other treatments might be effective at preventing, either killing the virus or preventing the virus from infecting other cells. And quickly, a number of drugs were identified as potentially effective. And so in an article published on February 4th, in a well-known, highly respected journal, a Nature journal, Cell Research, a group of researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology reported that 2 antiviral drugs that had been developed for other purposes, remdesivir and chloroquine, did seem to be effective at inhibiting the novel coronavirus. Now, several things happened immediately. Both of these drugs, as well as another one called hydroxychloroquine, which is derived from chloroquine and somewhat safer, went into clinical trials. And doctors started prescribing them, all of these, immediately. And so over the course of the following months, doctors in China, and then in Italy, and then in Spain, and then in the United States started prescribing, in particular, hydroxychloroquine, because it was widely available and cheap, believed to be generally safe for patients with COVID-19, often in connection with other drugs such as the antibiotic azithromycin. So what you see here is that there's around the world a large number of doctors, way back in March even, the beginning here, were prescribing this drug widely. Now, perhaps you've heard of hydroxychloroquine, and there's a curious story about why that might have been. So on March 11th, someone tweeted the following: "Chloroquine will keep most people out of the hospital. The US hasn't learned about that yet." This guy, his name is Adrian Bai. He's a tech investor, entrepreneur living in Wuhan. He tweeted at 2 people, one of whom was a Bitcoin investor with an MD named James Sodaro, who soon after, along with an attorney named Greg Regano, produced a Google document in which they described all of the research supporting the use of chloroquine as a treatment for COVID-19, which they shared. Now, you'll note that this first tweet by Adrian Bai was retweeted just 29 times and liked just 89 times. But James Sodaro's tweet was retweeted 2.1 thousand times and liked 5.1 thousand times. So we're seeing an increase, sort of an amplification of this idea. Now, 3 days later, someone else, even more famous with a wider network, Elon Musk, tweeted this same Google document that Todaro and Regano had produced. It was retweeted 13,000 times and liked 56,000 times. He then elaborated that maybe hydroxychloroquine was even better. 3 days after that, Greg Regano, one of the co-authors of this Google doc, ended up on Tucker Carlson's show talking about the benefits of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. And later that same day, Donald Trump, in a press conference, claimed that researchers were seeing great results with hydroxychloroquine. After that, social media exploded with discussions of the efficacy and safety of hydroxychloroquine. But what was remarkable was that the people discussing this fell into 2 clear camps. On the one hand, you had Trump supporters who were tweeting about how the evidence clearly showed that hydroxychloroquine was safe and effective. On the other hand, you had Trump opponents and critics who were immediately tweeting about hydroxychloroquine was hype, that the scientists who had worked on it were charlatans, and that there was no basis in fact for the claims. This was true even though hydroxychloroquine at this point was as well or poorly supported as a handful of other drugs that were under active research, and was at that time the most widely prescribed drug in the world for COVID-19. Cailin?
Okay. So what we're seeing in the case of hydroxychloroquine is polarization. When we talk about polarization, we usually refer to something like a situation where you have subgroups in a society that are holding stable, mutually exclusive beliefs. Hydroxychloroquine is effective, it's not effective, even in the face of debate and discussion about these beliefs. Another thing we can define are belief factions. where we have groups of people holding multiple shared polarized beliefs. So for example, it might be that the same people who tend to think evolutionary theory is bunk also tend to think that hydroxychloroquine is effective, and vice versa. Now, in attempting to explain why we end up with factions like this, where you have this kind of correlation between beliefs about different matters of fact, people have often appealed to ideology, what we might think of these kind of common causes for factions. So have said something like, well, you have these different groups that have different shared ideologies, and these commitments to these ideologies make it more likely that these different groups hold certain beliefs. So for example, George Lakoff, in very influential work, has claimed that in the US, conservatives tend to hold to a strict father model of government and liberals to a nurturant parent model. And for example, he writes that the role of government, social programs, taxation, education, the environment, gun control, abortion, the death penalty, and so on are ultimately not different issues, but manifestations of a single issue, strictness versus nurturance. So the idea here is we have these different shared ideologies, and they feed into polarization about all these different factors. Now, when we think about something like hydroxychloroquine, that seems a little funny because it's not clear why anything about conservative or liberal ideology would lead some people to think that hydroxychloroquine was a particularly safe and effective approach for COVID, and other people to reject it, and even we've kind of seen take up remdesivir as the better approach. So one thing that we've argued in the past using models is that it doesn't always seem to be the case that ideology is driving belief factions. Now, ideology might be playing an important role in many cases, but in other cases, what we think is going on is something having more to do with shared trust and how that influences the way people listen to each other and take evidence for each other. So what we've tried to do is use models to investigate this process. Now, a lot of researchers have modeled polarization, and there's a common feature to these models, which is something like this. Similarity of belief or opinion tends to determine level of social influence in the model. So if you and I hold similar beliefs, I'm more likely to listen to things you tell me or uptake evidence you've shared than if we hold very different beliefs. This is instantiated in different ways, in different models, through network connections, through belief dynamics, but that general idea is usually there. So what we did was looked at models specifically tuned to scientific beliefs, things like, does hydroxychloroquine work? Or is evolutionary theory an effective theory? We looked at agents in these models who used social markers and especially similarity across belief to determine how much to trust information shared by others. And then we asked, well, can we get this kind of correlated polarization, these belief factions emerging endogenously just as a result of this social trust and not having anything to do with ideology? So the idea being, if you and I shared similar beliefs about evolutionary theory, then maybe when you tell me something about hydroxychloroquine, I'm more likely to believe it. And then that could lead us to be part of a kind of faction of different beliefs that are strange bedfellows. There's no particular reason for them to go together. So we found in our models that this could indeed happen. And again, I'm not going to go through the details of how we build these models and what we find, but I'll give a kind of image again. So here's our social network, but now we can envision that there's some existing polarization, maybe over whether evolutionary theory is good. So some people think yes and some people no. And then there's some new claim. So I'm going to represent the new claim by a blue overlay over these little nodes. And maybe at first it's just pretty random who holds the new claim. Some number of people have heard about hydroxychloroquine and on the basis of it thought that might be an effective treatment for COVID-19. So this might start to spread via the normal social ways, But it could be that it happens by some accident of history to spread particularly widely in one group and less widely in another, or prominent members of that group might spread it to many people who listen to them or follow them. And once that happens, members of the other group might start to back away from that belief, find it less trustworthy, and it might spread quite widely through just one group, and then end up not being taken up by the other. So there might not be anything special about the belief, just the fact that the people who are now trumpeting this belief are only trusted by people within one of these existing factions. So some important takeaways from this kind of case. So this is a case where no one needs to be spreading misinformation. Maybe some people are, but no one has to be. And you can nonetheless have a lot of people end up misinformed because of this kind of factionalization, because people only trust particular others who already share beliefs with them. We don't have to appeal to underlying ideology to explain these factions. It still probably plays a role, but maybe not in every case. Notably, when you have polarizing figures like Donald Trump and they promote specific scientific claims, and especially without proper vetting, because Trump has definitely overstated the claims or the case for hydroxychloroquine, they run the risk of polarizing these claims, of turning them into claims that now are going to become socially meaningful, attached to a particular identity. And hydroxychloroquine here could just as easily have been something else. It could have been remdesivir. Things could have turned out differently. So the point is that these dynamics of trust and in and out groupism can really lead to just weird facts about the ways people are misinformed. All right, so I guess to summarize here, we talked about two ways people can be misinformed that aren't functioning via the kind of typical traditional analyses of misinformation and disinformation. So we talked about information zombies, where you have these originally possibly legitimate, possibly scientific ideas that start spreading, but then once they're reversed are very hard to stop. We talked about belief factions, where facts about the way people trust each other lead to misinformed groups. And with that, we will thank you and wrap up.
Great, thank you both so much. This is really quite terrific and informative, and really brings a nice kind of analytical acuity to this whole problem of misinformation and disinformation and its spread. We've got a little bit of time for questions, and there are some questions in here, and I'll just start off with one right off the bat. Can you comment on how retractions or revisions of scientific papers could be viewed as diminishing the news value of an initial report? And if the goal of news outlets is to maximize the number of views on a reporting piece, then I could see the potential internal conflict when stories grab huge numbers of viewers and then are subsequently determined to be not accurate, and so are not followed up with the same vigor as the initial breaking news.
Yeah, so actually all of this work in scientific communities on retraction is quite relevant to this, because like journalists and news outlets, scientists often are actually incentivized not to be very clear about the fact that their work has been retracted, and the journals that publish scientific papers also have an incentive not to be very clear about that. Because of course, once you make clear that something's been retracted, it both reflects maybe on your reputation, but also, as you point out, stops it from spreading. And the sort of goal of news outlets is to get attention to the things that they're writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really a confluence of issues here that make these sorts of cases really difficult to solve. So one is just as you say, Bill, in place of first news asked question, the news outlets are pretty strongly incentivized not to retract things or to revise things if they can avoid it. Meanwhile, any kind of either information literacy or algorithmically based procedure for identifying misinformation are going to run aground on these sorts of cases, right? So, you know, a reputable source like the Wall Street Journal, like a major newspaper, is publishing on a scientific study. One of the authors of the study has written the report. That's the sort of thing that looks like it ought to be reliable. And I think it should have been considered reliable when it was published. It's just that other facts down the line have changed, so that is no longer reliable, which makes it extremely difficult to figure out how anyone is supposed to, short of being an expert, figure out how to adjudicate these things.
A related question, you had said that we should be shouting retractions from the rooftops, right? But then given the kind of world that we live in, and I'll just kind of note one of the questions here was, how do we know this talk on misinformation isn't itself a form of misinformation, right? Given that kind of world and distrust in elites and elite institutions and questionings of science in general and the public perception of science, how can we shout retractions from the rooftops and even be heard?
Yeah, so it's tricky, right? And nothing is going to be perfect. And even if you do shout your retraction from the rooftop, it might be that it doesn't reach a whole lot of people who are out there hearing about the original false thing from a lot of sources. So it's not a suggestion that's meant to sort of make information zombies go away, but it's kind of one of the best, something that we can at least try to do. And in particular, because of this thing we were just talking about, where there are these incentives not to shout these things from the rooftops, I do think we see a lot of cases where the original source, such as, the bioarchive, where we had that posted picture where they just put withdrawn in a tiny little dot, and who would even know looking at that it had been withdrawn, aren't doing the best they can to kind of reverse these false claims.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here too on information zombies, and the question has to do with whether there are pieces of information that ought not to be shared or pieces of information that ought not to be endorsed. And there's a sort of subtle difference there that's kind of interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. So I'm not sure. So there's a common practice on Twitter where if you go to someone's page, their profile, you'll see underneath their name, retweets do not imply endorsements. And that is like so much weaker even than putting withdrawn in the upper left-hand corner of an article as a way of indicating that although I am spreading this information, that I might myself not believe it. I'm not really sure that this is a distinction that within sort of the social media space can really track a meaningful difference. If you share something with a critique of it, that would be one thing. But sharing something and then not in addition endorsing it, I'm not sure that that's any better than endorsing it. There is another issue though regarding the role of news media in sharing versus endorsing scientific articles. And one of the things that I think is really striking about the coronavirus is that we're seeing the scientific peer review and publishing system being strained to a breaking point. The fact that we're seeing preprints posted one day and then the next day or 2 or 3 days later, the article appearing in a peer-reviewed journal already copy edited and published, is already astounding. But it means that the peer reviewers had a day, perhaps, to evaluate this. There's no way that this is vetted the way that scientific articles normally would be. And so even peer-reviewed research, much less preprints, are undergoing a necessarily less rigorous process than you would normally expect, which makes it even more important for sort of media organizations that are going to report on this to not focus on single studies. So it's not going to be the case at this point that any one study is the thing that shows once and for all that the coronavirus is more or less deadly than everyone thought. It's one more piece of data in a growing body of information, all of which is probably faulty in one way or the other, but which by looking at it in on the whole, the total body of evidence, is going to help guide reliable beliefs.
So if I could quickly say something about this idea about the distinction between sharing and endorsement. I think often when people, I think often when people talk about that distinction, what they have sort of in the back of their mind is an idea that we as humans and as a society are really good actually at sifting through true and false beliefs and separating the wheat from the chaff. But we know that that's not actually true. We're not actually that good at it. And so sharing things that are false has consequences, you know, real world consequences for the people who trust them. And so some idea that you can just share things without endorsing them, there's no downside to that, I think is the wrong idea.
Thank you. And maybe one last question here. I know there are a couple of others, but this one relates to some stuff that was just coming up in your responses to the last one. And the question is, have you looked at how the effect of lack of access to scientific literature among the general public affects mis and disinformation? Given that many scientific journals are behind a paywall, the average person would likely not be in a position to fully read these kinds of articles. And, you know, what's interesting to me about these sort of preprint things is, you know, those are often put out there in the name of open access to science, but it means that they're not the things that are going through the rigorous peer review, which once it does go through peer review gets locked up behind the paywall. So could you comment on that? Thanks.
This is one of the reasons we've really been focused on the role of journalists in media here, because they're playing such an important role as an intermediary between members of the public and members of the scientific community, making this stuff that's very, very hard to sift through unless you're a total expert. I mean, even for people in like a slightly different area of science, it might be impossible to sift through, making it understandable to a wider audience.
Great. Well, listen, thank you both so much, Cailin O'Connor and Jim Weatherall from the Department of Logic and the Philosophy of Science here at UCI. We really appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. I've learned a ton. I hope that our audience members have as well. This session has been recorded and will be available on the School of Social Sciences website later on today or maybe tomorrow morning. So you can view it and share it with your friends. I also want to give a shout out to Andy Hall and the Social Sciences computing staff for all of their support for making these webinars possible. Thank you all once again. We will be announcing more of these Zot Zeries on the school's website and via social media, and we hope to see you all again. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. And more questions are coming in, but they're all like thank yous. Thank you, great presentation and project. And Andy can save all of these and get the rest of the questions to you as well if you wanted to see what they are and respond.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Well, I'll sign off. Thank you again.
Thanks for organizing this. Take care.